Bom dia a todos. Eu quero, em primeiro lugar, agradecer a presença de vocês nessa manhã atípica no nosso cotidiano institucional. Vou mudar para o inglês para o professor Stephenson nos entender. Professor Stephenson, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to come to Rio. We have a lot of fans of your work here, including Ana Migueis and Vitor Aguiar, which also have accepted our invitation to take part in this event. We are very interested in what you have to say for us. Professor Stephenson is a Harvard professor. He's a professor at the School of Law of Harvard, and he will talk to us about comparative and historical perspectives of the anti-corruption agenda. So, Professor Stephenson, thank you very much once again. The word is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation to come to Rio. I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to come here. I'm especially delighted to have the opportunity to speak to this group. I know the importance of the work that this office does, and it's a great honor to have the opportunity to speak to all of you today. I understand that the last 20 hours or so have been, has been a time of a great deal of turbulence, if you will, so, and people's minds may be on other things, so I'm especially grateful that so many of you were able to join us today. We decided that I'm going to give some opening remarks, but then the balance of today's session is going to be organized as a conversation with me and my friends Anna and Victor, who I've known for many years now and have had the opportunity to have many fantastic conversations with them in more private settings, and today we'll be able to talk about some of the issues that we care so much about in this more public setting. So thank you to all of you. I have, as you heard, I'm based at Harvard Law School. I do a variety of different things there, but for the last decade or so, a great deal of my work has focused on issues related to corruption and anti-corruption. And it's a fascinating topic. It can also be a very depressing topic to study in many ways because there are so many examples of failures and setbacks, and it's such a seemingly intractable problem. There are some international success stories. People like to talk a lot about Singapore in the 1960s and Hong Kong in the 1970s. And those success stories are important, but those are small city-states. They were already at least reasonably well developed. They were not democratic states. There could be really kind of top-down crackdown. So I often thought that it would be useful for those of us in the anti-corruption field if we could broaden our focus somewhat to try to find other examples of at least partially successful campaigns against corruption that we could learn from, that we could draw on a wider range of experiences. So a few years ago, I thought it would be interesting to do a case study of one particular country that had a struggle, a fight against corruption that was actually relatively successful. No country has eliminated corruption, but this country in particular I thought would be an interesting case study. And I thought it would be interesting for a bunch of reasons. So the country I had in mind is a large country, big land area, big population. It's a political democracy, unlike Hong Kong and Singapore. It's political democracy, but one with high levels of political polarization, sometimes resulting even in political violence, including deep divisions between urban and rural areas, as well as sectional divisions in different parts of the country. And also, this is a country where there was a lot of corruption, like really extensive, pervasive corruption that took a bunch of different forms, some of which may sound familiar to you. So there was a lot of corruption, for example, in the natural resources sector. Things like land for development, logging and timber, natural resources like oil, huge amounts of corruption in the natural resources sector related to extraction of natural resources and development of land. Also, huge amounts of corruption in major infrastructure projects, like transportation mega projects in particular, huge amounts of corruption, politicians getting involved, secretly owning shares in the companies that were receiving massive government subsidies to do these massive transportation projects. So that was interesting. And then also, a great deal of political corruption. What we sometimes call machine politics dominated, especially, though not exclusively, at the local or municipal level. A lot of vote buying, a lot of patronage-based politics, purchase and sale of offices, all this stuff. Really pervasive corruption. Any guesses, by the way, what country I'm talking about? Anyone? Anyone? Want to shout it out? Sorry? The United States. So my home country, the United States, in the mid-19th century was very much what I just described. And this is why I thought this was so interesting, because today in the United States, we certainly haven't gotten rid of corruption. There's still a huge amount of corruption in the contemporary United States. You just need to look at your favorite news site that covers US politics. The Trump administration was especially bad on this. State and local politics still full of corruption. If you've read about New Jersey Senator Robert Menendez, who's under investigation, probably going to be indicted for serious bribery. So I don't want to sound like I'm standing up here saying my country, the United States, has eliminated corruption. It certainly hasn't. But 2023 in the United States looks nothing like 1873. 1850 and 1950 look totally different. What I just described with respect to the dominance of machine politics, patronage, vote buying, natural resources corruption, infrastructure corruption, pervasive corruption up through the mid to late 19th century. And then things start to change, such that by the time you get to the middle of the 20th century, corruption is still a significant issue, absolutely still a significant issue, but it becomes more what we might call an aberrational problem rather than a systemic problem. Right? There's a difference between systems where corruption is just the way the system works, it's the way things get done, it's normal, to systems where it exists and we try to fight it, and it still occurs, but it's not seen as the normal way politics just happens. And so a co-author of mine and I decided to, I'm not a professional historian and neither was he, but we decided to look a little bit more closely at the history of our own country on the logic that we can't, I want to be very clear, it would be a mistake to try to draw facile lessons from historical examples or to try to identify best practices because there's so many differences, right? Culturally, historically, all sorts of differences, but I do think that widening our field of vision and looking at a larger set of cases, not only contemporary but also historical, can give us, enrich our understanding of what approaches to fighting corruption might be more productive. Maybe there are things that we can learn even if we can't just simply copy and paste from another country's experiences. So I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for our conversation. My opening remarks are really just to set up that conversation, but I do think it would be useful to note some of the things that I felt like I learned that I didn't know before, and that my co-author and I felt that we learned when we did our investigation of anti-corruption in U.S. history. So again, I'm simplifying a lot. We looked mainly at the period between the end of the American Civil War in 1865 and the beginning of America's involvement in World War II in 1941. So that's a period of about 3/4 of a century that we looked at. And again, if you look at the period before then, corruption is deeply pervasive in U.S. politics. And at the end of that period, corruption still exists, but the world looks quite different. So what are some of the things that we thought were interesting to observe based on the U.S. historical experience? And I'll name a few. The first one is that change is possible. And that might seem like an obvious, banal thing to say, but having studied corruption for the last 10 years and had the opportunity to talk to many people, scholars of the issue, but also people who live and work in countries that are beset with pervasive corruption, it can often seem intractable. When you're in the middle of it, you have the sense that nothing can ever get done. We do this, we do that, nothing changes. We look at our Transparency International score, it hasn't moved at all. And there's a sense that it can't be solved, that countries are just locked in to either being corrupt countries or non-corrupt countries, that corruption becomes something you would treat like your climate, or whether you are tropical or whether you border on water. So like just a fixed fact about the country that can't be changed. The US experience and the experience of actually several other countries historically suggests that's just not right, which for me at least is at least cause for optimism, right? Even countries where corruption seems deeply entrenched and deeply ingrained, things can change, but it often takes a long time. And this is the second lesson or observation that I at least drew from my study of my own country's historical experience with corruption. The process took, again, if you use those sort of arbitrary dates that my co-author and I used, 1865, 1941, so that's 3 generations. That's 3/4 of a century. And while you were in the middle of it, the change might not necessarily have been perceptible. There were periods where you're making progress, and then there were periods of setback. But if you look at that sweep of historical time, there really were significant changes, which again, to me, is cause for at least cautious optimism, that we shouldn't necessarily be so fatalistic or cynical that nothing can be done and nothing ever changes, because the efforts of committed anti-corruption activists, politicians, civil servants, journalists, and others over a 3-generation period really did accomplish substantial change that I'm convinced made lives better for enormous numbers of people, but you couldn't always see it in the moment. Okay? Now, this relates to yet a third observation that I think is important here. I think the experience not only of the United States, but many other countries in the wealthy West or the wealthy North should cause us to be skeptical of cultural determinism in arguments about corruption or anti-corruption. So again, having had the opportunity to work with people, to engage with colleagues, friends, other scholars in many different countries, including countries that have a lot of corruption, I often hear these cultural determinacy kinds of arguments. And the arguments always take the same form, even though the particular country or culture gets substituted in and out. So I will hear in Brazil that, like, look, it just goes back to the Portuguese in the 16th century, and we inherited certain cultural forms from them and certain forms of politics, and, like, we're just stuck. When I was in Indonesia, I heard almost exactly the same thing, except it wasn't the Portuguese. It wasn't even the Dutch. It was like traditional Indonesian, I was told by Indonesian friends and colleagues, cultural patterns and paternalism. Heard the same thing in China. I heard the same thing at a conference once by a Nigerian colleague who said very strongly, it's just so deeply ingrained in our cultural DNA. He wasn't happy about this, but he thought there's no way we can make this change. If you look at the way the United States was in the 18th and 19th century, you would actually see commentators at the time, people who visited the United States from other people, and people in the United States who said, it's just American culture. Right? It's just no way to get around. So the American culture is just so focused on like greed and materialism and so forth. It's just inevitably going to be corrupt. And I don't want to deny that culture can be significant. We're all influenced by our cultures. We all carry with us the inheritance of cultural patterns set by previous generations. But again, it can be a mistake to treat that as a kind of strong determinant of your future. Again, if you look at a country like Sweden, in 1800, which was beset by patronage, nepotism, oligarchy, it would be very easy if you could take your time machine back to 1800 and look at Sweden and say, it's just the Swedish culture, right? They're just culturally predisposed to corruption. These days, people have this idea that, well, the Scandinavian countries have some cultural inheritance that makes them naturally clean. It's not true. Right? It's not true, and this is true. This is in the United States and other places in the world, and so I think we should take seriously the role that culture can play in the way we think about problems and approach them. But I think we should be cautious about adopting simplistic, deterministic narratives about culture just locking you into particular patterns that can't be changed. Let me also say a little bit more, some more specific things we noticed about the pattern of the fight against corruption in the United States that may or may not be relevant to other places. One thing we observed is that the experience of the United States, we think, calls into question this idea that one often encounters that the key to fighting corruption is shrinking government or shrinking the state. So it is certainly true in the United States that as the economic role of government expanded, as the economic significance of government decision-making expanded, corruption increased in proportion to that. Right? When the government is handing out valuable corporate charters or monopolies on certain kinds of resources, or contracts to do things like build railroads or canals, there are extraordinary opportunities for corruption, extraordinarily lucrative opportunities for corruption. So naturally, dishonest people, that's where they focus. But if you look at the longer sweep of the historical experience, the times when the United States seemed to be making the most progress in fighting corruption were not times when the United States government was shrinking or getting smaller. It's actually quite the opposite. The periods of the growth in the scope and power of the government, especially the federal government, seems to coincide with periods in U.S. history where we were making more progress in getting corruption under control. I'm thinking especially of the progressive era in the first decade of the 20th century, and also the so-called New Deal period under President Franklin Roosevelt. So why might this be? We're not sure, I'm not sure, but here are a few speculations that may be relevant. One is that citizens are more likely to monitor government more closely when they feel like government is more directly involved in their lives and livelihood. Right? When government is doing things that you can feel, when you depend on government for your health care or education or various other kinds of services, when the government is doing things like building roads in your neighborhood, and it doesn't seem like an abstract thing far away, you become much more conscious of and sensitive to the threat that corruption can pose to those projects. So it's possible that citizens pay more attention, monitor their governments more closely, and care more about government integrity as the role of government expands in a perceptible way. Second, at least some politicians, and this was especially true of President Roosevelt during the New Deal period, have a much stronger incentive to crack down on corruption in government programs when they're trying to expand the reach of the state. So President Roosevelt knew that the success of his New Deal policies and programs would be undermined if opponents of the New Deal could show that the programs were really vehicles for corruption or channeling money to politically favored entities. And so he and his administration actually had a very strong incentive to crack down on corruption precisely because they were promoting a larger state. Third, a lot of the expansion of the size of government and the role of government in the United States in the period that we're interested in had to do with building up a social safety net, a social welfare state, which we think, and some historians think, helped undermine the political machines that had dominated so much of US politics, because those machines, there was vote buying, like literal vote buying sometimes, but more often the machines would do things like provide you with coal to heat your house in the winter. If your relative got sick, they would step in to provide support. They would help find jobs for you or your relatives. So that cultivated a kind of loyalty where then if the local party leader said, vote for our guy, you would do so, partly because that was part of the understood social bargain. And even if the machine was stealing a bunch of money for the bosses, ordinary voters, ordinary citizens would feel like it was still kind of a good deal. When government provided social welfare, social insurance, and so forth starts to become more widely available, people are less dependent on the party machines. Okay, so I forget what number I'm up to, but another observation that we drew from the US experience was that the US had an interesting combination of what you might call direct and indirect strategies for reducing corruption. And let me frame this in terms of a debate that you sometimes see play out in the anti-corruption community. So some who care a lot about fighting corruption really focus on the importance of law enforcement, criminal law enforcement, anti-corruption crackdowns. This is a little bit more popular in the policy community, especially among politicians. As against that, you sometimes see the view that fighting corruption through that kind of direct criminal law enforcement strategy won't work or can't work, and the more important thing to do is to get at the root causes of corruption, reducing the opportunities or incentives for corruption through more indirect kinds of reforms. The US experience had both of these things, working actually in tandem with each other. So on the one hand, there were a lot of reforms that were not directly and explicitly about corruption exclusively, but played a very significant role in reducing the incentives and opportunities for corruption. Civil service reform was one of the big ones, right? So prior to the late 19th century, positions in government offices from the top down to the bottom were basically made on the basis of political loyalty. Right? If your guys won the election, you would fire all the old people and you would put your people who would help you get elected into those jobs. And that didn't do much for the overall quality or competence of the civil service. It also provided fertile ground for corruption, right? People would pay people to make sure they would get a good, cushy job where they wouldn't have to do much work after the election. There was a movement to promote civil service reform. It took a long time to be successful. This connects to my earlier point about just how long this takes. Nearly 20 years from when the first bill was proposed in Congress to when it actually passed, and another 20 or 30 years until the civil service system covered most of the federal bureaucracy, but made a big difference. Expanding the powers of independent regulatory boards to make certain kinds of decisions rather than leaving those to partisan political actors also made a really big difference. So the preventative strategies were a big part of the US success story, but so was direct enforcement. I think sometimes people in the academic or scholarly community, in their effort to show how sophisticated they are, that's not criminal law enforcement alone can't do it, they're right, but criminal law enforcement actually played a big and important role in the US as well. And it proceeded in stages, right? Again, this is the theme I keep coming back to, is how long it took. So initially, a lot of what we would today consider corruption wasn't even against the law. There weren't federal laws against bribery. The laws got expanded, the loopholes got closed. Then for a while there were those laws, but they weren't really enforced. And they start getting enforced, but only against lower level people. Then eventually you start to see enforcement against higher level people, cabinet secretaries, sitting judges, and so forth. So that was also an important part of the story. And so for me, one of the things I see in the US experience, these different aspects of the strategy working together. And that relates to the final observation that I'll make before we turn to what I think will be the more fun part of today's event, and that will be the conversation with Anna and Victor. In the US, in terms of how progress was made, there was an interesting combination of what we might call top-down and bottom-up strategies. So critical to the success of anti-corruption reforms in the US were politicians, ambitious, enterprising politicians who embraced that cause. People like Theodore Roosevelt at the national level, and then governors at the state level, people like LaGuardia, governor of New York, and La Follette, governor of Wisconsin, who took that agenda on and really pushed it. They were probably sincere, but they also realized this was a way to win votes and win support. That combined with a more bottom-up strategy, with citizen activism through what we would today call civil society. Back then, that term hadn't been invented, but there were these reform leagues, that's what they're called, leagues, of concerned citizens who would push for reforms. Oftentimes, the professional classes or middle class played a significant role. People who were not necessarily always worried about where their next meal was coming from, but also weren't the super rich who benefited from the system, were very active in pushing for these kinds of reforms to make the system more fair. Some business interests, right? The role of business in anti-corruption reform is actually kind of complicated because some, the ones who were doing well, were perfectly happy to leave things the way they were, but there were significant sections of the business community that were not at all happy with corruption the way things were being done, were not happy with having to pay bribes to politicians or the local political machine. So they were able sometimes to make common cause with progressive civil society reformers that they might not necessarily have agreed with on all issues, on this issue, and then put pressure on or support reformist politicians. Journalists played a crucial role as well, then as now. The so-called muckraking journalists of the early 20th century got a lot of readers by exposing really tawdry corruption scandals, but through that helped stoke more public anger and build more support for the reformers. So it seems like at least part of the success of US anti-corruption reform was having a fairly broad-based coalition involving different sectors of society, civil society, journalists, and reformist politicians. But again, and this is the point that I keep coming back to, and I think it'll be the appropriate note on which to end this part of the formal opening remarks, it took a long time, right? Looking over 75 years of history and compressing it, as I've done in my opening remarks, makes it seem like steady progress from the world of the 1850s, which is just rife with corruption. Look, any developing country today, if they had the Transparency International scores 150 years ago, and you could go to the United States in 1873 or 1850, they'd get a lousy score. To 1940, 1950, 2023, when they get not a perfect score, but a good one. In the moment, though, it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So in the decade after the Civil War, it looks like there's some progress, then there are setbacks. In the 1890s, there are big breakthroughs with the civil service reform law at the federal level, but then it stalls at the state level. Early 20th century, you get a burst. The first decade, 1900 through 1910, 1912, the heyday of what we call in the United States the progressive era, President Theodore Roosevelt and so forth, a lot of progress. But then big setbacks in the ensuing decade under President Coolidge and President Hoover. Then you get to the New Deal period under President Roosevelt in the 1930s, and then you get forward progress again. So if you were living through that period in the moment, especially at one of the bad times, it might seem like nothing was happening and that everything was stalled and that everything was miserable. But if you look at the longer sweep of history, actually those incremental gains, even when there were some partial setbacks, helped lay the foundation for greater progress by succeeding generations. And this is one of the few research projects I've done on corruption and anti-corruption that actually made me feel more cheerful at the end of it than I felt at the beginning. Because it is kind of an optimistic story. It's a problem that will never be solved, I don't think never be eradicated, but it does seem like it's a problem that can be confronted and tamed if there are consistent efforts by a broad spectrum of social and political actors over several generations. And I hope that's a message of encouragement to people who are working on those issues in the here and now when it might seem like their efforts aren't having any kind of immediate payoff. I do think that the history not only of the United States but many other countries suggests that those efforts really can bear fruit. It just sometimes can take a longer time. But that's all I have to say by way of opening remarks. I hope that is more or less a good intro to our conversation. And now I guess I'll take this with me and I'll move over here and have a conversation with my friends.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Stephenson, for your incredible remarks. I took some notes so that I wouldn't forget anything. But you definitely defy our main perspective that we're stuck with our Portuguese heritage and change is not possible. So there's light at the end of the tunnel, although the path may be hard and longer than we would want. So I have my first question to you. I think that it's natural because it comes from your initial remarks, but also because we are at a house of civil servants. So I think that, and also that was the theme of my PhD, so also another reason why I want to ask about that. My first question regards specifically the role of civil service reforms and professional independent civil service in tackling corruption. You addressed that, and you definitely mentioned that civil service reforms were extremely important in the cleaning process of U.S. government, but I would like to hear more of you about how civil service reforms can reduce corruption. And on the other hand, I would also like to hear more from you on the importance of the existence of some political control of bureaucracy, because we are kind of stuck in the middle of this path. On the one hand, it's important that we have a professional independent civil service, but on the other hand, we're still in a democratic government. So we cannot leave her under a technocratic rule. So I would like to hear more from you about this duality and, well, how it connects to corruption. But thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and it's a real pleasure to have you here in Rio and in our house. Thank you very much.
Well, again, thank you very much for the kind invitation to join you. Your question is really terrific, and it actually touches not only on my interest in corruption, but the other aspect of the other main aspect of my research agenda, which is precisely on these issues of administration, bureaucracy, and the tensions between independence and democratic accountability. So I'm not going to be able to do justice to such an important and broad question in my brief answer, but let me try to touch on some aspects of it. So first of all, absolutely, I think civil service reforms generally, the creation of a professional, independent, and capable bureaucracy is crucial for good governance generally and for reducing corruption more particularly. I think there's a lot of evidence to this effect, not only from things like the US historical experience that I described, but other political scientists and economists who have tried to look across countries have found, I think, persuasive, if not, absolutely scientifically indisputable evidence that civil service reforms of these sorts that are designed to depoliticize government agencies or certain kinds of government decision-making is associated with lower levels of corruption or perceived corruption. And I think that's but it's hard, and your question is so good because it gets at a fundamental tension, which is that on the one hand, an independent civil service can be a bulwark against political or partisan corruption. It can be insulated from some of the pressures to engage in corrupt activities, and that's good. The patronage politics can have a corrupting influence on how government departments operate. At the same time, that's not always true. There are also examples where corruption is deeply embedded in a bureaucracy, and it takes concerted action by political actors responding to democratic pressures to break, essentially, the corruption in an entrenched bureaucracy. So I referred in my opening remarks to Hong Kong, and again, I don't want to, that example is problematic, but I'll just use that to illustrate the point that I was just making. The incident that inspired the dramatic reforms in Hong Kong with respect to corruption was an incident involving police corruption. A police commissioner stole a huge amount of money and basically fled the jurisdiction. There was corruption in a lot of different departments in Hong Kong, but the police was an especially thoroughly corrupted entity in Hong Kong in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And again, this was not an issue of democratic accountability because Hong Kong was not a democratic government, but this was definitely an issue where the bureaucracy, if you will, was the police bureaucracy, had been thoroughly corrupted, and it took an outside force coming in to clean that up. So there's always the danger of a civil society group, it's not a civil society, a civil service organization or a bureaucratic organization using its protections, using the mechanisms that are supposed to give it independence to shield itself from being cleaned up. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. It does point to the importance of building up an independent bureaucracy with high integrity and then shielding that bureaucracy from the corrupting influences of partisan politics. But you need to figure out how to clean it up in the first place. And this is a very, very difficult problem or challenge. Also, there's a self-reinforcement phenomenon that I've also done a little bit of research about that I find very interesting, where if you get a bureaucracy or department or an agency that is relatively clean and has a reputation for being relatively clean, that will tend to attract a certain kind of person that will continue to preserve and enhance the integrity of that office or department, where if an office or department has a reputation for being corrupt, it will attract a different kind of person and things can get worse. So I think part of the issue has to do with the rules and controls you put in place on the civil service, for the people who are already there. But a lot of the challenge has to do with recruiting good people and recruiting the right kind of people and retaining them and making them want to continue to work in the government. So yeah, there's so many more questions I don't want to say. I hope that's mostly responsive. But I do think the issue of attracting people, selecting them, and retaining them is maybe sometimes underappreciated because personnel is maybe more important than anything else. If you get the right people and then find ways to protect them and support them, I think you're going to be in good shape. If you get the wrong people, then it kind of doesn't matter if you have the best rules in the world. If they're the wrong people, it's not going to work.
I think it brings a lot of reflection to all of us. So I will pass the microphone to Victor.
Thank you. I moved to this seat so we can share the microphone. It's an honor to have you here, Professor Stephenson. The first question I would like to ask you, I feel the discussion about anti-corruption agenda in Brazil is still very much stuck or caught up in trying to find the perfect tools to reduce corruption. For example, we discuss whether we should provide more incentives for corporations to build corporate compliance programs, or what would be the best arrangement for a leniency agreement. But I feel that sometimes we forget that the main issue there is not a technical one, it's a political one. And for example, in Brazil, I feel that corruption is an instrument for building coalitions, for example. It's part of the game. So my question is how hard it is, or what could be done to build the proper incentives for political reforms and to create coalitions that could try to improve this scenario and try to make these kind of reforms happen?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's really hard. Actually, I'm not going to have a good answer to this because in some ways you're asking one of the most fundamental questions about anti-corruption reform. But I'll try, let me react a little. I'm not going to be able to give a fully satisfying answer, but let me offer some reactions. So first, I think you're completely right. The main challenges in fighting corruption today, I think, are not so much the technical aspects of it as the political aspects. That doesn't mean the technical aspects are unimportant, right? Absolutely, you should strengthen your whistleblower laws. You should have strong laws against corruption with appropriate sanctions. You should create mechanisms, as you alluded to, for appropriate settlement agreements with corporations or other defendants when doing so would be in the public interest and would produce more evidence to get to the heart of corruption schemes. All that stuff is really important. So I think when you say it's more of a political problem than a technical problem, that shouldn't be interpreted to suggest that we shouldn't pay attention to incremental policy reforms that can make things better. But I do think that precisely because most of the anti-corruption toolkit is relatively well understood at this point. I mean, people come up with new ideas, which is great, but most of what we need to know in terms of the toolkit is already there. The problem is a sustained long-term commitment to using those tools effectively when it's politically difficult to do so. I don't want to be flippant about this, but especially as I get older and older, I often think of the analogy to trying to lose weight. Like, you know, everyone really knows if you want to lose weight, then you need to eat a healthier diet and exercise more. And every year there are these fad diet books that come out with like cut out all carbs or eat like the paleo diet or the French diet or whatever. Like fine, it's all fun, but it's all variations on the same theme, like eat a healthier diet and exercise more. And the reasons that some of us like have trouble actually losing weight is not because we don't know how to do it. It's difficult to sustain that commitment over time. Easy to have a short term, like for 3 months, I'm going to hit the gym, like right after New Year's, and then it kind of falls apart. But again, that's a sort of a flippant analogy to the more serious topic, right, of fighting corruption. It really gets at you get to the heart of the question: how do you build the coalitions for sustained political momentum? Because it's relatively easy for a new government to come in and announce we're going to have a big crackdown on corruption, and it lasts for a while and then kind of recedes. So I don't have a good or easy answer, but I'll offer some thoughts. One is, as you say, building coalitions is, I think, really important. Not just coalitions at the political level, but social coalitions, including coalitions among actors who might disagree on other issues. So I alluded in the United States to the sections of the business community and more kind of do-gooder civil society type reformers are able to form a coalition to support certain kinds of reforms. In the more modern United States, I was really struck by, in the push for greater corporate transparency, some of you might have followed this, the efforts to require companies to disclose their actual human owners to the government. The lobbying for that really involved a quite interesting coalition among a variety of different groups that wouldn't always necessarily be working together. So groups like Transparency International, but also the big banks, and also faith-based or religious organizations, and others, and law enforcement groups and others. So that was an example of building a broad coalition on a relatively narrow topic. I also think, one of the biggest challenges in building a sustainable coalition against corruption is that anti-corruption tends to be very popular in the abstract. If you poll voters in all different countries and you ask them, like, do you think we should be doing more to fight corruption? They'll say yes. If you say, do you think corruption is a big problem in the country? They'll say yes. If you ask them in the abstract, if a candidate for election was credibly accused of corruption, would you be less likely to vote against that candidate? They'll say yes. When it becomes specific, when it becomes concrete, behavior changes, right? People tend to overlook or deny or not care about corruption by people on their team in the partisan sense, and to then wield corruption or corruption accusations as a weapon against the other team, sometimes based on actual facts and sometimes less so. And when corruption becomes a highly partisan issue, I think that's very destructive to an effective long-term anti-corruption agenda. And this creates real dilemmas. I think in the United States, during the Trump administration, there was a lot of corruption in the Trump administration, including serious issues related to conflict of interest. But I think many people who care about corruption, anti-corruption, who didn't like the Trump administration, want to call out their corruption, were concerned about what might happen if corruption became coded as a partisan issue. If you think about what happened to environmental protection over time in the United States, it started out with pretty broad-based cross-partisan support in the 1960s and 70s, when major rivers are catching on fire in the United States, then you get a kind of broad coalition to support environmental protection. Over time, it became coded as a left-wing issue, which actually made things difficult. And the concern about building a broad anti-corruption coalition is how can you continue to take a stand against corruption, call out corruption involving specific politicians or specific political parties without turning it into such a partisan issue that at least half of the political spectrum stops caring or people start tuning it out. One of my students who writes for the blog that you wrote for at one point, he's American, but he's from a Pakistani family. And he was writing about Imran Khan in Pakistan, who's currently in jail. He's running for president and is very likely to win if he's allowed to run. He's hugely popular, and why is this? Pakistanis care deeply about corruption, at least if you poll them. They say corruption is a huge problem in their country. They know it's widespread. They complain a lot about it. And part of what's going on, at least, is that Pakistani politicians accuse their opponents of corruption all the time. It's sort of standard issue. And when they're in power, their opponents get jailed on corruption charges. And mysteriously, the people in power never seem to be subject to those kinds of investigations unless there's a successful attempt to impeach them. And so his thesis is that basically, even though Pakistanis hate corruption, would prefer non-corrupt politicians, they just started tuning it out. It just becomes part of the background noise of politics, and it's not an issue that mobilizes people. So I think that part of the challenge for anti-corruption reformers who care about this issue is to find ways to build coalitions across sectors, across parties, to find ways to avoid it being kind of captured or weaponized by certain political factions that are just exploiting anti-corruption rhetoric for their own interests, and to sort of maintain a genuine commitment to that agenda. So it's not a complete answer to your question because there's no one's discovered the sort of secret for building an effective anti-corruption coalition. But I do think, again, given that what I and others have found, not just in the US example that I gave, but across many different examples, there are few examples of really rapid success. Again, everyone likes to talk about Hong Kong and Singapore, but most of the anti-corruption success stories involve long-term incremental progress. So the challenge is to find ways to maintain that over time. And I do think building coalitions and keeping your focus on those issues and trying to get every little win that you can when you can is probably the best one can hope for.
Thank you. So I have a follow-up question, and it's interesting because I had already taken notes of this question, and it perfectly connects to your previous remarks. So I don't know if that is true in the US. You could definitely approach this subject, but in Brazil, I think that it's relatively true that the anti-corruption agenda has become majorly associated with the political right. Usually the theme of corruption and seeing corruption as a pervasive subject has become profoundly associated with the political right. And we were discussing this over dinner yesterday, and there are a few analysts, or a relatively considerable number of analysts, that would say that the election of Bolsonaro, for example, was, at least in part, a response for this sentiment of widespread corruption in Brazil. And I don't want to discuss particularly political preferences of people, but in a more general way. Do you think that the anti-corruption agenda and corruption scandals being all over the news all the time can, at the end of the day, produce an unintended consequence of people losing faith in democracy and turning their hopes for anti-system figures such as this new wave of populist figures that we have seen in Brazil, in the US, in Argentina, in Hungary, and Poland, and several other countries. How do you think that the anti-corruption movement can protect itself from becoming a slippery slope for anti-democratic figures?
Yeah, so you guys are not asking me easy questions. But you're asking me the important questions. These are the questions everyone is asking, everyone should be asking. I want to be very cautious in terms of how I answer this question, because I think you alluded to this. I recognize that Brazil, like my home country, the United States, is a politically diverse, heterogeneous country. And we have an audience of I don't know how many of you are here, but I suspect there's diversity among the members of this audience and what they think about important figures in Brazilian politics. I have written publicly about some of the issues related to Lava Jato and Bolsonaro and Sergio Moro and so forth. So you can find online my views on at least some of these things, but I do want to make sure I'm appropriately respectful of this forum, especially being in a place like the Attorney General's office, which is supposedly a nonpartisan entity. So I'll try to be cautious. If I slip a little bit, please forgive me, because it's hard to answer this question completely in the abstract. But you highlight this important phenomenon, which is that very often serious exposés of corruption scandals, especially those that reach the highest levels of government, are followed by political figures, populist figures, sometimes we might say pejoratively demagogues, but we can maybe bracket the pejorative language for the moment, who leverage public anger, understandable, justified public anger at disclosures of serious corruption, serious breaches of trust by high-level political figures to power a campaign that's very much built around the idea that everything is, drain the swamp, said Donald Trump as a political candidate. Only I can fix it. We need to throw the whole thing out, blow it all up. We need a total outsider to get rid of everything that's corrupt. Very often, and again I want to be careful, I'll use examples outside of Brazil, very often these figures, when they come to power, turn out not to be paragons of virtue and integrity, and the anti-corruption agenda is either quickly forgotten or repurposed just as a partisan weapon. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, when he was running initially against the socialist government, he made a lot of their various corruption scandals, and Viktor Orban's government is extremely corrupt. And we could multiply example upon example. So this is certainly a thing that happens. And this, as you say, creates potentially a dilemma for anti-corruption activists, because you're worried that by exposing the depth and extent of corruption, you're going to create openings for potentially even worse demagogic politicians who will exploit that agenda. So what can be done? Gosh, I'm not sure, but here are some thoughts or observations. The first thing I think it's worth keeping in mind is that a lot of these politicians use the rhetoric of corruption. They don't always mean the same thing, and voters are not always responding to that rhetoric in the same way. So I think, based on my outsider's observation, that in Brazil, in the immediate wake of the election when Bolsonaro was elected president, I think a lot of Brazilian voters were angry about actual corruption, like the way that people in my field typically define it. I don't think when Donald Trump talked about corruption and draining the swamp, he was talking about bribery and embezzlement. I think for him, corruption became a code word for foreigners, immigrants, elites, Jews, etc., controlling the political system and making it work against the interests of you, the real American, capital R, capital A. So I don't think the political forces that propelled Trump to office were angry about like actual corruption, but I think in Brazil they were. I think in Guatemala when Jimmy Morales was elected, like it was also a backlash against an actual corruption scandal involving significant bribery and embezzlement. So this is an answer to your question, but I do think it's important that we not lump all of these things together, because sometimes when these demagogues use the term corruption, they actually mean corruption in the sense of bribery and embezzlement and various other kinds of breaches of public trust. Sometimes it's a code word. And if you think they're actually talking about corruption, it'll be a big mistake. So when they're actually talking about corruption, what to do? Well, it's challenging, again, because yes, exposés of corruption, major corruption investigations can damage people's faith in democracy and create openings for these outsiders, but failure to address corruption in significant ways can also significantly undermine public trust and commitment to democracy. So I think there's also a risk in just letting these things go unchecked or unchallenged. I do think, and here this is more for the anti-corruption community of activists and other political actors, I do think there's a real danger in the rhetoric of the system is rigged, they're all corrupt, all the politicians are all like, et cetera. And you sometimes see this rhetoric even from well-meaning anti-corruption activists or well-meaning political activists who want genuine kinds of reforms that I would tend to support. Like in the United States, I think our campaign finance system needs significant reform. I don't think it's good. I think it creates too many opportunities for wealthy people or wealthy interests to influence our politics. I don't think it is healthy or productive for people associated with the campaign finance reform movement to say things like, there's no difference between the two major political parties, they're all bought and paid for, they're all in the pockets of the corporations. I do think that tends to feed a kind of public cynicism, right? That if there's no difference, we might as well blow it all up. Like there really is genuinely a difference. I think the rhetoric of, all those politicians are all corrupt, I think that does a disservice to the people who are genuinely trying to make a difference. I don't want to say there's no country in the world, but I can't think of a major democracy, like an actual democracy where it's true that all the politicians are completely corrupt and that everyone is taking bribes. I think that rhetoric, I think there's a sort of fashionable cynicism that's actually deeply unhelpful and counterproductive. I think it's important to focus on the fact that not every civil servant takes bribes. Not every politician is embezzling funds. Like the people who do it are actually breaking a norm. They're not acting consistently with a norm. And so I think that message is an important one that often gets drowned out because it's easier and maybe more energizing. And again, maybe might make you seem more sophisticated in some perverse way to talk about how everything is bad and everyone is dirty and it's all a swamp and it's all a cesspool. So I do think, would that prevent like a Viktor Orban or a Donald Trump? No. I mean, it's not like Donald Trump got elected because some lefty activist group said, well, the corporations control everyone. But it didn't help. I think also more appreciation of the necessity for coalition building, of the willingness to call out corruption even when it is not necessarily in the interests of your favored political parties, the existence of anti-corruption organizations that seem pretty principled and not terribly partisan. I think those are all important things. Again, there's not an easy or simple way to answer this. I do think the risks of the weaponization of anti-corruption rhetoric is something that those people who are really concerned about corruption, anti-corruption should be aware of, because it is so potent, and if it's overused or abused, I think it can both undermine the anti-corruption agenda by making people think it's just partisan rhetoric, and it can create openings for populist demagogues who are not going to serve the interests of that agenda or their countries.
Thank you, Professor Stephenson. I would like to ask you another follow-up question on this. You talked a lot about the political side of this relationship between anti-corruption campaigns and democratic backsliding. But I'd like to ask you about the public officials' view on it. How can we, and especially prosecutors, conduct anti-corruption campaigns avoiding this risk. I mean, effective anti-corruption campaigns, but avoiding this risk of promoting, of destabilizing the political system. Basically, should public prosecutors, for example, consider political consequences of their enforcement decisions when they are dealing with a case? For example, I remember to have a similar conversation with Professor Tushnet when I was at Harvard, and he had some ideas about, for example, avoiding this kind of personification that we had in Brazil. Oh, this guy is our anti-corruption hero. I think it might be. And you also wrote about that in your article about the future, how should Lava Jato end? You talked about that, avoiding national heroes and anti-corruption. And what do you think about it? How anti-corruption campaigns should be conducted, trying to avoid this kind of risk?
Yeah, what a good question. So actually there's several questions wrapped into that one. So let me try to address the different components of your question. So one of the first things you asked about is whether or to what extent the people who are engaged in anti-corruption work, especially investigators or prosecutors, should think about the political consequences of their action. As it happens, I'm just now undertaking a research project with a collaborator at the Harvard Kennedy School on precisely this topic, because I've wondered about this myself for some time, and I'm not sure we've got a terribly good answer to it. Let me tell you about the conversation actually that got me thinking about exploring this in a serious way. So I was at a conference maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and it was kind of a closed-door meeting of anti-corruption prosecutors from different countries. And it was a Chatham House rule, so I can't identify anyone by, not only by name, but by any way that would allow you to figure out who they were, but I can recount the exchange. And it went something like this. This very question came up in a room full of anti-corruption prosecutors. Someone, I forget who it was, asked, like, when you're deciding whether to investigate or prosecute a case, do you think about the political consequences for for elections, but also for your own agency? Like, what will happen to you if you do this? And two prosecutors from two different sub-Saharan African countries responded, and one of them said, "Absolutely not. I do not think about those issues. It would be inappropriate for me to think about those issues. I need to treat each case on its merits based on the evidence of the wrongdoing, the seriousness of the wrongdoing, and it would be inappropriate for me, given my role as a prosecutor, not a political actor, to take politics into account. It would be counterproductive if I did so." And then the second gentleman, also from a different sub-Saharan African country, said, "Well, for me, of course I take politics into account. I have to take politics into account. I would be incompetent and foolish if I did not take politics into account, because I've got a young agency. I'm in the country that I'm in. I can't be guaranteed that we'll survive politically, and I would be irresponsible." One of them said, this was one thing that struck me. The first one said something along the lines of, "It would be irresponsible of me to take political consequences into account when making prosecutorial decisions." The other one said something along the lines of, "It would be irresponsible of me not to take political consequences into account when making prosecutorial decisions." I think this is a fundamentally difficult, challenging problem. I'm almost certain there's not a consistent, correct answer across countries, because there's so much variation. Interestingly, I think that even for those prosecutors who ought to take politics into account, it is important that they be perceived as not taking politics into account, which creates a fundamental difficulty or paradox, because if they are seen as taking these kinds of consequences into account, it will undermine their credibility. It will be politically bad if they are seen to act politically, and yet I think that in some circumstances, again, it would be foolish of them not to think about these kinds of things. In the same way that, courts officially don't take politics into account, but especially in newly established countries, new democracies, for example, I think about the history of my own country again, and as many of you may be familiar, Chief Justice John Marshall, in his early decisions, including cases like Marbury versus Madison, was very much thinking about what are the political consequences if I make this decision versus that decision. So it's very, very challenging. Maybe if you invite me back next year or the following year, and hopefully Jiyoung and I will have made more progress. But actually, Brazil is one of the case studies we're thinking about looking at. We were hoping to interview some Brazilian prosecutors and civil society experts to get a sense of both what did Brazilian prosecutors think about, especially those affiliated with Lava Jato, and what should they have. My collaborator is an American, but one who is of Korean ancestry and who speaks fluent Korean. So we're thinking about using South Korea as another case study where this issue has come up because the activities of South Korea's relatively new anti-corruption entities are very politically sensitive. A number of former presidents have been prosecuted or tried for corruption, and also very powerful and well-connected business executives at firms like Samsung. In Thailand, where I've spent a fair amount of time, these issues have also come up. So it's hugely challenging, and the prosecutors have to walk a very fine line between taking these things into account enough, but not starting to be seen as political actors. Because once they're seen as political actors, whether it's because they're perceived as going after someone for political reasons or abstaining because they're worried about the backlash, that significantly undermines their credibility. Now, the other part of your question also raises a really interesting, challenging problem. You talked about, you referred to the Brazilian example, but there are others as well, where the anti-corruption campaign gets personified. You referred to the heroes, but they're also the villains, right? So sometimes the fight against corruption really does get personified into particular heroes or villains, right? The bad guy, we learn all about, the fancy watches and the gold-plated toilets and the yachts and so forth. There's something visceral that people respond to when someone who's supposed to be a public servant is like having that much stuff. It's probably tinged with envy to some degree. Like, not all human beings are saints. Like, why does that guy have all that stuff? Like, he took it from us. He really gets you fired up. And then the heroes, right? The champion, the heroic person who's willing to take on the system. Think about all the movies or books that involve, the one person brave enough to stand up to the system. That's viscerally appealing. But you're right, that's dangerous. It's dangerous because if you think corruption is a systemic problem, it's not like the moral failing of one person or a set of people. It's about systems and incentives that need to be changed. And the fight against corruption, as we were suggesting before, requires coalitions and institution building and the hard work of hundreds or thousands of people who never will get any publicity but are just like down in the trenches doing their work. If you put all your hope in an anti-corruption hero or champion, there are a couple of risks. One is the risk that if your champion lets you down, it can really deflate the movement. That person also becomes the target of people who want to discredit the anti-corruption movement. Now they have a target to shoot at. If they can show, that person's just a hypocrite. He or she is also, dirty or political or whatever. It can really drain energy from the movement. It can also detract sometimes from the kind of institutionalization that needs to be done for long-term effective anti-corruption work. There are certain countries, and I'm not here thinking about Brazil actually, but one or two countries, again, one in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a real sense there was a heroic leader of the anti-corruption agency, but once he left, it kind of all fell apart because he hadn't actually been that successful in building up the institution. But on the other hand, right, you're asking a Harvard professor, there's always going to be another on the other hand. On the other hand, anti-corruption also, I think, to be effective, does have an element of popular mobilization. There are probably some examples where you made significant progress in anti-corruption where it's just done at like the elite level through prosecution, but oftentimes you need to mobilize people. People need to care about the issue. People need to get fired up about the issue. And people who focus on issues of narrative and public opinion often will say, people don't get fired up about statistics and facts and figures and data and learning that, countries with below a certain score in the corruption perception index are like 6%, how lower per capita income. Like this, it doesn't resonate with people. People get fired up about narratives and stories with heroes and villains, right? People want to identify with a person who's a person of integrity standing up to the bad guys in the system. The anger that people feel, right now it's strange to talk about Israel given what's going on with the war, but a pre-war example of Benjamin Netanyahu and the corruption accusations against him, like people got fired up about that a lot because there was like in the Israeli media played up a lot of the really tawdry stories that like really get people interested and angry. And there are other examples from other countries as well. So I think the tricky balance to strike, right, is how do you mobilize popular opinion again, ordinary people who don't spend all their time, thinking about politics or reading detailed analyses, if you need their support, narratives with heroes and villains and stories that people can follow and get invested in can be really important. And we, from the more sort of intellectual professional class, shouldn't be too dismissive of that. Like, that can be really important. But at the same time, there is a danger, exactly as you point out, in over-personalizing or valorizing certain kinds of individuals, and again, it's as with many things. It's a careful balance that we need to strike. But then again, even that's not very satisfying, because it's not like there's one person striking this balance. There are like thousands of people all doing their own thing. But perhaps the answer is, if you feel like the personalization is going too far, find ways to cut back on it. For those who are in the position where they are the kind of symbol or spokesperson for an anti-corruption movement, you should try to make sure you balance using that voice that you have to influence the public debate, while also trying to make sure you build a foundation so that it's not all about you. And I will say, maybe a controversial thing to say, putting aside the last 2 years or so, I actually thought the Lava Jato people did a pretty good job at that overall. I mean, that was my impression. Again, that gets into, I know it's very delicate to talk about in Brazil right now, but I do think before, and now it's fashionable to be it was fashionable for a few years to think Lava Jato could do no wrong, and now we seem to be in a position where it's sort of fashionable to sort of dump on them and how they screwed up. I think there's still a lot of value, a lot of things to be learned, and the other countries will learn from at least parts of the Lava Jato investigation. And I think when people look back on that period, maybe with a little bit more distance, even in Brazil, I think people are going to have a more balanced but on balance positive take, specifically on that aspect of it as well.
I would like to shift a little bit our debate now. I think that it might give everybody some time to breathe. So my next question is something you said in your initial remarks about strategies, both direct and indirect, in corruption tackling. And you mentioned civil service reforms, which we already addressed, but you also mentioned the importance of independent regulatory boards. And so I would like to propose a question regarding those independent regulatory boards. First, how do they connect with the anti-corruption agenda, but also about the actual possibility of independent regulatory boards, especially considering other types of capture, for example, economic capture of major economic actors and problems of revolving doors and everything, and all these challenges that are studied when we discuss regulatory agencies and regulatory boards in general. So I also think that there is a huge risk involving those entities, both regarding political capture, but also economic capture. We were also talking about that in the little room before we came in, and we were discussing exactly that, for example, in Brazil, regulatory agencies are often used as part of the political coalition, and you were saying that it doesn't exist, at least not in that format in the US, but on the other hand, the economic capture is a very real risk. So, and of course, economic actors are also intertwined with corruption and big companies and big infrastructure projects, as you also mentioned in your initial remarks. So I'm sorry to leave everything unwrapped, but my next question regards independent regulatory agencies and corruption and economic capture and all together.
Yeah, so, okay, a lot there as usual. Where to begin? So, something that came up in our earlier exchange is relevant here as well, which is that when we design these agencies, we're balancing competing values, and there's no way to get a perfect solution, because there's a kind of inherent trade-off between the values or the virtues associated with political insulation and the values or virtues associated with political accountability. And there's there's no way to completely resolve that tension. It's an inherent tension. There are certain kinds of decisions where we think it's not a good idea for partisan politicians to be making those kinds of decisions. I mean, there's a reason, just an obvious one, there's a reason that we have independent courts, right? There's a reason we don't have political actors deciding innocence or guilt in particular cases. But on the other hand, if we live in a democracy, and we think that it's really important for public decisions to be made by actors who are selected by and or responsive to the voters, then there's a danger in over-insulating particular kinds of decisions. And so we're always trying to find the right way to strike that balance, and you can't go too far in one direction or the other, and there's never going to be a perfect solution. Also, it's any time the government or a government entity is making a decision with significant economic, material, or other kinds of substantial consequences for people in the world, people are going to try to influence that decision, right, through legitimate or illegitimate means. So when you talk about capture, which is a term I don't love, actually, because it implies a particular dynamic that I'm not sure the empirical literature really supports that well, but when you talk about the attempts of private groups to control or influence or direct the decisions of government entities, that's always going to be there in one form or another, I think. And there's no way to get rid of it. I mean, even if you tried to make it illegal, right? Even if some countries try to make certain kinds of lobbying just illegal, then it will occur through illegal forms. Now, that doesn't mean all those forms are equally good or equally bad. It's just like there's all pointing to like this agency, there was an attempt to control it or influence it, doesn't necessarily show that particular form was bad, because you always have to compare it to the alternative. So, with respect to independent regulatory boards, I certainly don't think that every kind of government decision should be made by an independent board that's not directly connected to the governing administration. I'm not sure the decision whether or not to go to war should be, given to an independent board of like international relations experts, and that the president will just have to follow their decision. Like that doesn't seem. Oh, maybe it's not a bad idea. I don't know. But it's like off the top of my head, that seems like the kind of thing which is instinctively like, no, that's the kind of decision that needs to be made by the political actors. But whether to give a charter to this corporation or not, or like what the railroad rates should be, or what the appropriate price for natural gas will be. Like there seem to be a lot of decisions where I'm not sure I want those decisions made in a direct way by partisan political actors. They should have some influence, right? I like the idea that they can, they have a role in appointing and removing the senior people, and they can use other kinds of tools at their disposal, including the threat of altering the governing statutes to restrict or expand jurisdiction in various ways. But I tend to think, and I do think the evidence bears this out, for a lot of decisions, it will be better overall and less opportunity for corruption if there's some insulation from partisan politics. So yeah, it's true that independent regulatory boards can be captured, but so can legislatures, right? So can more partisan operatives, and in some ways it's easier to do so because there's a more direct conduit for private influence. So that's why I do think that in the U.S. historical case that I described, the creation of more of these independent regulatory boards did seem to be associated with improvements in governance quality and lower corruption. Again, it didn't eliminate it, but I do think that there was an association. So I do tend to think that that's productive, and that's why I'm very skeptical, very nervous about proposals like Donald Trump now, in the last days of his administration, attempted to push through this new executive order that never went into effect to shift control, to remove essentially a whole bunch of government employees from civil service protections, and has promised that if reelected, he's going to substantially reduce the independence of various so-called independent agencies and substantially relax or eliminate civil service protections for most government employees who are doing anything other than purely ministerial tasks. And that strikes me as extremely dangerous from an anti-corruption perspective.
Thank you, Professor Stephenson. This is our last question before asking for questions for our audience. And you always say that you are not a Brazilianist, but we all know that you have been following Brazil at least for the last 10 years? And so I have to ask you, how do you see the future of the fight against corruption in Brazil from now on? I mean, considering that we have passed through a lot, how do you see the future of this topic?
Got it. So a small, narrow, focused question for the final one here. Yeah, so you are right. I do always protest, especially at events like this, that I'm not an expert in Brazil or Brazilian politics, and this is true. I don't speak Portuguese. I never studied this in university or afterwards, but I started studying corruption, anti-corruption in a serious way in around 2013 or so, and partly because of Lava Jato, but not just that. Brazil is an obvious country of great interest and importance, and I found myself engaged in these conversations with Brazilian friends and colleagues and others for a while. So while continuing to emphasize the caveat that I still don't consider myself an expert. Brazilians love to tell outsiders, like, Brazil's not for beginners, we're all like really complicated. And like, I get it, and it is. But I'll try, let me try. I'll try to give you a sincere answer to the sincere question. I think that the present of anti-corruption in Brazil is not great. I think that when I started doing this, Brazil was an example that people were pointing to, that like people all around the world are looking to the Brazilian example and the Brazilian model of how a country that's been mired in quite significant corruption for a long period of time, as a democratic country, can nonetheless make significant progress. I think a lot of people are looking, again, really looking to Brazil as like a model for like maybe other countries can emulate Brazil's success. Not that Brazil had cleaned up corruption, if you believe things like the Transparency International indicators, like it was still, and if anything, it had gotten slightly worse, but I think that's just because more of the corruption that had always been there was exposed. There was definitely the sense that Brazil is a country to watch, like it's really, really a great example. And people aren't talking that way anymore. I think that in terms of the international discourse about Brazil, some of that discourse now points to Lava Jato as just an example of abuses and overreaching and politicization. And others who might still have a more positive view of Lava Jato generally are really dispirited or demoralized by the way that so much of the work of Lava Jato has been undone or undermined or nullified or what have you. So I would say the general attitude, again, in the international circles, not just the Brazilian circles, that I participate in these conversations as well, the way people talk about Brazil, if they talk about Brazil, has changed a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, and not in a good way, which is disappointing. A former student and co-author and I wrote a book chapter that I think one of you alluded to earlier for an edited volume on Lava Jato. It was called How Should Lava Jato End? This was before it had actually ended. And we talked about the things that we hoped would happen going forward, and like none of that happened. It was like the opposite of everything we said we hoped would be good. It was like, well, what did we say? We said things like, really, actually picking up on some of the themes you talked about before, it's, we really hope that there's a focus on institution building and moving the focus from individuals to building up institutions so the lessons can be passed on. We hope that it becomes a nonpartisan issue, that people reach across the aisles, that for center left and center right people sort of join forces to promote an anti-corruption agenda. We kind of went on in this vein, like none of that happened. So it's not good right now, but again, there's a reason, or one of the reasons I want to talk a little bit about the work that I did with my friend and collaborator Tino Cuellar about U.S. history, is that if someone were writing about U.S. anti-corruption progress in, let's say, 1915 or thereabouts, when there was a lot of retrenchment, move over the 1920s, after what had seemed like such great progress during the Progressive era, they also might have been pretty depressed and pretty despondent and feel like nothing is really going well. But then there was a resurgence, and the progress that it made in the previous era actually did help serve as the foundation for future progress. So I want to be optimistic about Brazil as well in a couple of respects. So first, even if the big national level anti-corruption campaign, of which Lava Jato was the clearest expression and most important contributor, is really not going anywhere right now. I'm cautiously optimistic that there are a whole bunch of other initiatives below the surface that most people like me outside of the country don't hear much about, where there's still important work that's being done. I don't know this for sure, but I gather from some people there's still important things happening, local levels, municipal levels, and so forth. I continue to be impressed by the high quality of some of the civil society organizations in Brazil that work on anti-corruption issues. And they're more pessimistic now than they were before. They often find themselves under attack, but the people that I've encountered in Brazil who work on this professionally, I've been quite impressed at their integrity and commitment, and that gives me some hope for the future. I do think that when some time passes, I said this earlier, I think the assessment of Lava Jato and its contributions will be more balanced and on balance positive when the sort of immediate aftermath of the extreme politicization of the conversation about that investigation subsides a little bit. I do think that some of the important legal reforms that occurred, some of them before Lava Jato, will continue to be important going forward. So my hope, and I will try to be optimistic, is that it's a long-term process, and that at least the memory of some of the positive things will help serve as the foundation for the next generation of people who are going to work on these issues to continue to move them forward.
Thank you very much for all your enlightening remarks, Professor. We would like to ask for questions from our crowd.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Professor Stephenson. My name is Eduardo Carvalho. I'm a prosecutor here in the state of Rio. And you've mentioned earlier the scholarly debate regarding direct measures versus indirect measures, and whether specifically prosecuting high-level politicians, if it's a productive or counterproductive strategy, specifically in contexts of systemic corruption. And you mentioned that in the United States case, these things happened in tandem. And I was wondering, how does Lava Jato fit into this debate? Under which circumstances can this kind of criminal prosecution be an effective strategy, and under which conditions it may lead to failure?
Yeah, so it's a challenging question for which I don't have an answer in which I'm terribly confident. I feel like I don't really know enough. We're still not sure of the answer, because I think even though the Lava Jato task force has been formally disbanded, the story of Lava Jato is not over yet. So I think if I'm going to put a positive spin on it, it would go something like this. Yes, there was a lot of backlash. Yes, Lava Jato might have contributed to some destabilization of the system, and yes, there's been a lot of criticism of the operation now, but the fact that so many people, including very high-level people who might have previously been thought of as untouchable, were touched, right? Were caught, convicted, even if their sentences end up being nullified because of various, I find, rather dubious legal technicalities down the road. I do think that sends an important signal. I do think the idea that nobody is above the law, and that if you, as a person running the state oil company, or as a member of Congress, or running an important construction firm or whatever, recognize that people like you actually can go to jail if you do bad stuff. Maybe the odds aren't high, but it can actually happen. I do think that sends a very important signal and makes people think twice. And I think people don't like going to jail. And I know it's very fashionable to talk about the limits of deterrence and the limits of criminal punishment. And I agree with that in broad strokes. There's often too much emphasis, especially among politicians, about how we're going to crack down on this by putting people in jail. But I do think it makes a difference. And I think the idea culturally that nobody is above the law and that there are people who are and there are not people who are just untouchable. I think that's a very important message or signal to send. So that's one way Lava Jato could fit into this. If you want to, again, I don't want to try to impose a U.S. template on Brazil because there are so many differences, but I do think it was significant in the U.S. when Albert Fall, a former cabinet secretary, went to jail, right, after the so-called Teapot Dome scandal. Took a while, but I think that does send an important signal. So that would be the positive view. The concern that I would have, the pessimistic take, would be that if the narrative takes root, that it was all politics, that it was all a coup, that it was really just weaponization of prosecution, that could be quite bad. And what I'm really concerned about, and again, I want to be careful, I don't want to get too engaged in political debates that I know are ongoing and where members of this audience might have different views. I'm deeply concerned about personal retaliation against members of the Lava Jato task force or others who worked on those issues. Yes, it's true that in some cases prosecutors can engage in abusive behavior. In extreme cases, people who abuse their government authority in corrupt ways should be punished. But I also think there's a reason in the United States we have doctrines of immunity for prosecutors and judges who take action within the scope of their government duties. And there's a very high bar that's applied, a very high standard before you're going to impose personal individual sanctions on someone for what they did in the course of their duties. And my impression in Brazil, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, this is a potential understanding from an outsider who may be misinformed. My potentially misinformed outsider's impression is that a lot of what's happening right now is to try to punish individual people, individual prosecutors and others, not just as retaliation, but also to scare future prosecutors out of ever doing what the Lava Jato prosecutors attempted to do, by basically saying, you won't become a national hero. Instead, we're going to make your life miserable. We're going to assign you to parts of the country you don't want to be in. We're going to potentially, fine you. We're going to potentially incarcerate you if you dare to challenge the corrupt status quo. So the really pessimistic take, if I'm going to be really pessimistic about Brazil, is that it seems like if there's one thing the far right and the far left can agree on, is that they don't want serious anti-corruption work happening, and they will join forces to punish anyone who tries to hold them accountable. So that would be the very negative, very pessimistic take. So I haven't really answered your question. I've identified two possible ways that this could develop, and I think the story is still unfolding. If I were actually Brazilian and I was directly involved in this, this would be something where I feel like it's very important for right now for people in your community to try to shape the direction of how this goes, right? This is not, so for example, even people who are really angry at Lava Jato and all their various missteps, of which there were certainly some, and we can debate how many or how serious, I would hope would take a very strong stand against personalized, individualized retaliation against individuals who are involved, precisely because of the chilling effect that would have on future efforts to take serious action against corruption. I would hope that those people who were big proponents of Lava Jato would nonetheless do some serious self-reflection and soul-searching and acknowledge not only where there were limitations or failures, but in a productive, constructive way, how those could be addressed and how things could be improved going forward to build a more solid foundation if this sort of event should recur. So again, it's not a complete answer to your question because I'm not sure I can give a complete answer to your question, but that's how I would try to fit Lava Jato into that aspect of the conversation.
Good morning, Professor. It's an honor to have you among us. More than a question, I'd like to present a situation to make a comparison. As you may know, the problem of crime in Rio de Janeiro is not only in the streets, but from inside the prisons, okay? There is a chain of command that brings from inside the prisons, okay, the crime to the streets of Rio de Janeiro. I have here an issue of the last week Atlanta Journal that says that gangs in Atlanta commanded the crime in Georgia, okay, from inside of prison, helped by hundreds of corrupt correctional officers. That's I like to forward the newspaper for you if you want to check, okay? I'd like to have your point of view if this is inevitable, or would there be a way to prevent this help that these people, these correctional corrupt officers give to gangs, okay? Would there be any possible way to prevent that?
Great. So I'm not familiar with that. First of all, I'm thrilled that you have a physical newspaper. I often feel often feel old. Like that's great. So no, it makes me feel good. So I don't know about that particular scandal. I don't get the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is not one of the ones I regularly read, but the phenomenon you describe is one that is unfortunately quite common in the U.S. and elsewhere. It's related somewhat to something I said in response to one of the previous comments. You know, whenever people have money or influence or something to offer, there can be attempts to corrupt the system. Now, the way you framed your question was very interesting. You asked, "Is this inevitable?" And the answer to that really depends on what the "this" is. So I would frame it like this. Sickness is inevitable, right? We're never going to have a human society where nobody gets sick. But that doesn't mean public health measures are irrelevant, right? You can have situations where people are more or less likely to get sick, where disease is more or less prevalent. And if someone said, like, we're going to have zero tolerance for disease, we're going to implement reforms such that no one will get sick in our city or country next year, we would laugh at this person. That's like a ridiculous thing to say. On the other hand, if there was a public health measure that was proposed and someone responded to that by saying sickness is inevitable, so why are you bothering, we would also say that's a ridiculous thing to say. Like, of course, sickness is in some sense inevitable, but the prevalence or degree can be affected by human intervention. And I would say something similar about corruption generally and the particular kind of corruption to which you referred. Do I think it would be possible to completely eliminate corruption in correctional systems that allow criminals who are nominally incarcerated to influence what's going on outside the prison? I think probably not, or at least not at a cost we're willing to bear. Right? We could put everyone in solitary confinement and monitored constantly with video cameras and everything. Like maybe if you really went all out, you could stop it, but not at reasonable cost. We're never going to eliminate that. But do I think there are ways to reduce this kind of problem, to make it less likely, to make it less damaging? I'm not an expert on corruption in the corrections sector specifically, but I would imagine, yes, just based on the fact that in other contexts, those sorts of bribery of public officials and others can be reduced or mitigated. So do I think that the phenomenon can ever be eliminated? Probably not. So in that sense, it would be inevitable. But do I think that the degree or pervasiveness of this sort of corruption at its current level is inevitable? No, I don't. I don't know whether what happened in Atlanta is kind of like that was the kind of thing that the best measures are already in place and nothing could be done, or whether there are serious things that could be done to reduce it. But yeah, so that's the best answer I can give to your question. I'm not sure framing the question as whether it's inevitable or not is the most productive way to frame the question. I think the most productive way to frame the question is, are there reforms that could be implemented that would reduce the frequency or severity of this form of corruption? And there I just don't know because I'm not enough of an expert in that particular field.
Any other question?
Professor Stephenson, first, thank you so much for coming to Brazil to talk to us. It's always a pleasure to hear you. So I guess my question is about the relationship between development and lowering the level of corruption. Is it economic development necessary to lower the level of corruption, or is the other way around? Because all the examples that you gave here in the United States, China, Norway, Sweden are countries that were underdeveloped in the past and now we're not. and that used to be very corrupt and now are not. So my question, I think, is what is the relationship between economic development and corruption, the levels of corruption, and is it necessary to develop a country, economically develop a country, to lower the level of corruption, or is there other way around?
Oh yeah, it's such a wonderful question, because this is actually, for people who study corruption in the context of development economics, this is one of the burning questions that I don't think, people have different views. There's a lot of research on this. I don't think any research conclusively nails this down, but it's a terrific question. So just to elaborate a bit on your question, for those in the audience who maybe don't follow this literature in the academic field closely, there is a very strong correlation between a country's per capita income and its level of perceived corruption, an inverse correlation. So rich countries generally are perceived as less corrupt. It's also true, as you suggest, that if you look at economic and political history, improvements in governance and development seem to kind of move roughly together. But then this question is, well, which phenomenon is driving the other? So there is one view. I'll give the extremes, and the truth is, as often, is probably somewhere in the middle, but we don't know exactly where. One view is that economic development drives anti-corruption, and that really the best way to get a country to be cleaner is to help it to become rich. And there are a bunch of different reasons why this might be so. A population where people, as I said in my remarks, are not worried about where their next meal is coming from all the time, are more likely to start paying attention to things like how clean is their government, and you can support independent journalism and all those kinds of things. Anti-corruption measures, some of them are expensive, like if you're going to invest in these preventative tools, if you're going to invest in effective prosecutors, it may be hard to do that until you reach a certain level of economic development. And so on and so forth. So there's the extreme view would be, if you got a poor country, focus on development. And yeah, there will be corruption and it'll be bad, but really you want to develop the country as quickly as you possibly can, and that anti-corruption is kind of a luxury for richer countries. The contrary view, again, if you take the extreme opposite view, is that institutional quality, governance quality, is in fact the key to economic development. And that corruption is a big part of that, because corruption undermines institutional quality and the quality of governance. So it would be a profound mistake on this view to say, let's focus on development, not on anti-corruption or other governance improvements, because that view, according to this counter view, actually means the country's going to stay poor, because your development, the various things you're trying to do to promote development are not going to work unless you address the corruption issues. So again, those are the polar views. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. These are probably mutually reinforcing processes. So it's probably true that economic development is helped along when you have better governance institutions. It's probably also the case that improvements in overall national wealth can be used to strengthen governance institutions. But we don't really know, I don't think we know. Having read a lot of this literature, I don't think we've really nailed down which is the more important thing to focus on, or what the relative proportions are. So again, it's not, really the way I'm answering your question is I don't know. I don't think collectively the academic community knows for sure the answer to that question. I would tend to think that moving along both of these tracks together is probably really important. I think that as countries start to develop, and here I'll draw again on the work in the United States, as countries start to develop, opportunities for corruption, incentives for corruption tend to go up, right? People don't really steal that much when there's nothing to steal. When suddenly money starts rolling in, people try to figure out how to get a hold of it. And at that point, I think it's crucial that countries try to invest some of the wealth that's being generated by development into getting corruption under control, and doing so rather quickly, because if they don't, then you can end up in a political system that's dominated by basically a wealthy elite class that has figured out a way to appropriate all of the wealth for itself, and that will hold back more development going forward. I think, though I can't prove this is true, that might be especially the case when a lot of development is based on natural resource wealth. Right? Find ways to share that and make sure that process doesn't get corrupted right away, or else you can get locked into kind of a sort of, you got resource wealth but not much else. So again, it's not a complete answer to your question, but I tend to think working on both of these things together is important, and I do think it would be a mistake to neglect the kind of good governance and anti-corruption part of the agenda on the logic that we could just put that off until later when the country is wealthier.
Anyone else? Anna and Victor, do you want to make a last question to Professor Stephenson?
Is it okay for you? So, Professor Stephenson, my last question, at least today, this morning. You know that where we are, the Attorney General Office is part of the state administration, and we do not deal with criminal law. So, beyond criminal law, what does the latest research tell us or suggest as the most efficient instruments to detect, prevent, and curb corruption? Whistleblowing programs, auditing, what else?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This relates to the exchange that we had before, because before you'd emphasized sort of a desire to move away from the technical aspects of anti-corruption to think more about the political aspects. But now in your last question, you're pulling us back to the technical aspects, which is great, because I agree.
I'm contradicting myself.
You're not.
I have a job to do.
I actually don't think it's a contradiction, because I said in response to your earlier question, although I think some of the fundamental challenges are political, I also think it's important to try to figure out what are the specific incremental changes that can be made that make things better. I don't think we should be dismissive of those, even if we recognize that in the long term we've got to find a way to address this political problem. So, both of the things that you mentioned, super important. Whistleblowers, whistleblower protections, and auditing. So on whistleblowers, I'm not familiar with the state of Brazilian law on either of these things, so I won't try to answer with respect to what Brazil specifically should do. Okay, there should be. So whistleblower protection seems like the bare minimum. So ways for whistleblowers to report complaints anonymously and like genuinely anonymously is really important. Robust protections for whistleblowers against both public and private retaliation, really important as well, because it's almost a cliche that corruption is not a victimless crime, but it is often a crime where the victims are not directly involved, right? If someone mugs you on the street, like you know you got mugged. If you end up being poor or where you have medicines that aren't, effective or whatever because of corrupt deals that are happening in back rooms, you might not know about that. So there's no one necessarily to report the crime. Sometimes investigators and prosecutors can uncover corruption without internal whistleblowers, but boy, whistleblowers are really, really important, both in public organizations and also in private sector organizations. Right? In big companies, a lot of times we only find out about corporate crime because there are whistleblowers. So protecting the bare minimum, even better than that, I happen to think, although I can't claim to have read research that substantiates this, rewards programs for whistleblowers. In the United States, as some of you may know, the Securities and Exchange Commission, there's a law that anyone who reports to the Securities and Exchange Commission material information that results in the SEC imposing sanctions of $1 million or more on any regulated company, the whistleblower gets a percentage of the recovery, right? And part of the reason this is important is that whistleblowing, even if you have protections against retaliation, is a really scary and possibly dangerous thing to do. People are taking a great risk when they do it. It's a psychologically difficult thing to do. And so not only protecting whistleblowers, but creating affirmative incentives, meaningful affirmative incentives for whistleblowers to come forward, I think is really important. Audits, really important. A lot of academic research suggesting that even the threat of an audit can lead to significant changes. Some of them might have to do with corruption. Some might not be corruption. It might just be, better management. Actually, some of this research has been done in Brazil. I don't know if it still exists, but for a while there was a program to randomly audit municipal governments. The economists and political scientists loved this because it was random. So for the social scientists in the crowd, one of the reasons it's often really difficult to assess the effectiveness of various kinds of reforms or interventions is the selection bias problem. Like you don't know if this government adopted this reform, was it the reform that did it, or was it because this kind of government was different in some way? So we love randomization, and Brazil had this system of random audits of municipalities, and there was a lot of evidence that the threat of a random audit had made material differences. But it's not just Brazil. There's research in Indonesia and in Mexico and in the United States and numerous other places. So having professional auditors who can do a good job, who are sufficiently well-resourced, and where people know they could be audited at any time, actually makes a really big difference. Adequate protections for journalists, really important, right? So defamation law can be appropriate, there's a place for it, but to have protections for journalists against frivolous lawsuits, there's this phenomenon in the United States and elsewhere, they're called SLAPP suits, S-L-A-P-P, which is strategic lawsuits against public participation. It's basically when people sue journalists, often with frivolous lawsuits that they won't win, but just to make it really expensive to publish stories. And there are what are called anti-SLAPP laws that make it really easy for courts to dismiss abusive or frivolous litigation very early. So these kinds of things can be very important. Generally, media market laws that create the opportunity, that make it possible to have a lot of media outlets to operate independently, really important. We talked about civil service protections. I think that's also something that's really important. Corporate ownership transparency, I alluded to before when talking about coalition building in the United States. That's a very important, relatively recent measure, not just for corruption, but for other kinds of crime as well, because especially, we're not talking about the low-level official who takes a relatively small bribe, but people engaged in high-level grand corruption schemes need to hide the money or launder the money. And anonymous shell companies are a very popular way to do that. So those are, I'm sure I'll think of more right after we're done. But those are some of the things that I think are really, really important. And I'll connect this to something else I said before about the civil service. Just having appropriate systems in place for selecting and retaining the right people. I'll come back to that theme. Maybe that's appropriate given this audience. I'm sure you're all the right people, and we want more of you doing these kinds of jobs, because I do think that, let's put it this way, there are some countries where the civil service attracts the wrong kind of person. And this, I think, is really destructive overall from a corruption perspective and a more a general perspective. There are other countries where the civil service attracts the right kind of person. And again, this can have this self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing property. So I think paying more attention to who you're hiring and the responsibilities that you're giving them and how those people are chosen, I think that's actually a really important part of the indirect strategy for addressing issues related to corruption and good governance more generally.
So very quickly, so that we can end, I think everybody is starting to feel hungry. I think I would add to your list political reforms as well, especially considering in Brazil the opportunities of corruption that arise from coalitional mechanisms, and also not only in the executive power, but also in the legislative power, and especially over the last few years with the growth of budgetary control of the legislative, I think that political reforms are also important. So if you have final remarks considering this, and also final remarks in general, that would be incredible. But first, I would like to thank our audience, thank again the Attorney General's office here on behalf of Anderson Schreiber, who is for inviting Professor Stephenson, and everybody for coming, and also Victor for moderating with me and presenting great questions. So if you have any final remarks considering political reforms and any other subjects, please feel free, Professor.
Yeah, especially because people are hungry, I think, and anxious to get to lunch. I'm not even going to attempt to address in any kind of comprehensive way the massive topic of political reform, except to echo your point that, yeah, I should have mentioned that. That's very much a part of that's got to be a part of the conversation. It's so complicated, though, and the unintended consequences can be enormous. We were talking before, separately and informally over dinner, about how sometimes reforms, their attempts to crack down on the corrupting influence of private money in politics can have perverse or counterproductive effects if people become overly dependent on the public funds. And it turns out that the allocation of public funds can itself be susceptible to inappropriate influence. So it's really, really quite quite difficult problem to challenge, or quite difficult challenge to overcome, I meant to say. And I think I'm gonna have to refrain from offering general suggestions, in part because this is not a topic that lends itself really to general suggestions, because political systems are so different. I guess if there's a general lesson, it would be that. Like, it's a cliche that there aren't one-size-fits-all solutions and countries can't just copy from one another. I think that's mostly true. I do think there are areas where I think corporate transparency reforms in country A can be adopted by country B. I think a lot of the whistleblower protection legislation, I think a lot of that really is more transferable than is fully appreciated. On the subject of political reform and what kinds of political reforms would be most appropriate, that's so country specific that I think it would be very difficult and inappropriate to generalize. That would really require a deep study of the dynamics of any individual political system. In terms of closing remarks, I just want to echo or mirror you. Thank you again. I said this at the beginning, but let me say it even more emphatically at the end. Thank you all for inviting me. Thank you to the office for inviting me. Thank you, Victor and Anna, for providing such fantastic questions, and thank you to all of you for taking time out of your busy day to come and attend. I always feel self-conscious talking to a Brazilian audience about these issues because of my own lack of confidence in my knowledge of your country's very complicated situation, but I know how important corruption, anti-corruption is to Brazil. I mean, it might be a little bit less of a trendy front page of the newspaper topic now than it was when I started on this, but I don't think it's any less important. And I guess if I have any final message, as it were, I would come back to what I was hoping I was conveying in my opening remarks when I talked about the history of my own country, which is that for those of you who care deeply about this issue, just keep in mind it's a long struggle, and there are always going to be periods of setback and frustration and pessimism. But if my own academic study of the historical record suggests that these kinds of efforts, even if they don't seem to be making much of a difference in the short term, can really make a substantial difference in the longer term. So everyone who's working on this issue, whether directly or indirectly, I think is actually making an extraordinary contribution that's not always sufficiently appreciated. So it's very easy for me as an ivory tower academic to study these things and write about them in the abstract, but I'm very cognizant of and appreciative of the hard work that people like you do every day, kind of in the trenches, struggling with this issue. And I just want to make sure I convey my appreciation of everyone who's doing this hard work day in and day out, even if it doesn't seem like the payoffs are occurring immediately. And to again offer you what I hope is a message of like hope and optimism, right? Corruption, I feel like thrives on hopelessness. Right? Corruption is especially likely to persist when people just expect it will persist. So holding on to the idea that things can and should be different is, I think, really essential. And I hope you all carry that forward in the work that you're doing. And again, I'm honored to have had the opportunity to have this conversation, and I hope I can have many more conversations with many of you in the future. Thank you so much.